traffic wheel. The more traffic that gets sent or received, the more dollars that are paid. And what's really nice about transit is it's simple. You have an upstream service provider providing that service. You pay him dollars, and he makes sure that all your traffic gets out to the global internet, and in return make sure that your addresses are known and traffic can get back to you. So it's very simple, very convenient. If it doesn't work, you know who to blame. One thing that comes up then is, well, why do you even think about an alternative if that just works? And the answer typically is one of three reasons. One has to do with pricing. And let's take a look at pricing. When I started at Equinix, I was in an elevator with... Is Patrick Gilmore here? No. Okay, I don't want to make fun of him if he's not here. But he was in an elevator with me, and he said... I think he was complaining to the AboveNet guys at the time that he was paying $1,200 per megabit per second in 1998. Who remembers $1,200 per megabit per second? See, the folks who are just coming in now think that's just an outrageous price, and that's what Patrick was saying. $1,200 per meg is ridiculous. 5 years later, the price was roughly $120 per meg. And of course, people were complaining, 120 meg, that's absurd. That's absurdly high. I can't believe it. Everyone's always complaining about the price. And 4 years later, $12 per meg or less. So if we project that, 5 years forward, I think we'll be talking about $1.20 per megabit per second. How many people believe that's going to be the case? And it will be ridiculously high, right? So it's interesting. So you have this price of transit that continues to drop. One motivation for peering is that the traffic volume ends up being high enough so that when you multiply the traffic volume times the price, you get a number that's worth scrutinizing. But let's talk about the internet transit billing and how that works. It's done on a 95th percentile basis. And what that means is that meter that's spinning every 5 minutes spits out a sample. Bytes in from T1 minus T0. So you take that delta and divide that by the number of seconds, and you get a megabits per second number. You stack those numbers from lowest to highest at the end of the month, and that 95th percentile measure is the volume upon which you pay transit fees. Does that make sense?
Hey, Bill?
Yeah.
So just to heckle you a bit,
this is Steve Gibbard, by the way.
Are these numbers that are valid for all markets or just for particular markets? And are these prices available in the market that we're in right now?
Good question. On the previous slide, the $12 per meg, that's a number from the U.S. peering ecosystem. And I'm told it's actually a bit on the high side. The numbers that are bandied around in the peering forums tend to be on the $4 to $10, probably closer to the $4 a meg. But you also have to keep in mind that the peering coordinators, they like to strut their ability to negotiate. So whatever price you're paying, I'm paying less than that. You're just a lousy negotiator.
No, where I'm going with this is when you're tossing around these old numbers that sound absolutely ridiculous, I suspect those may actually be what people here are paying or somewhere close to that.
Oh, in different locations.
Right.
I think that the largest number I ever heard was $50,000 per megabit per second in the Philippines. That's a pretty amazing number. Okay, so everyone understands the 95th percentile? So the question then on the table is, how can you game this system? Just shout it out if you know. Patrick is here. Look at that. Yeah, so the idea is if you get that top 5% burst for free, only send a little less than that top 5% worth of traffic to that ISP, and the rest of the lowest samples end up being zero. So if you do that to enough ISPs, you burst at 900 megabit per second and then do zero for the remaining 96% of the month, and go to the next ISP and do the same thing. Of course, it's a bit dangerous because if you're not extremely careful, what's going to happen? You have a 95th percentile measure that's 900 megabit per second, and a second one that's 900 megabit per second, maybe a third. You could be triple, quadruple, or paying much more than that single 900 meg transit service. Does that make sense? Of course, this is one of the reasons that you see minimum commits. Minimum commits are when an ISP says, I'll sell you transit, but you need to commit to send me a certain number of megabits per second at a particular price. The more you commit to, the lower the price ends up being. So you end up with a kind of a cliff a graph like this. So what you end up having to do is figure out how much traffic do I know I'm going to send to this ISP, and that ends up being a calculation you need to do when you're comparing against what your traffic flow and your expectations are and such. If you commit to too much, you're going to end up paying for traffic you don't use. If you commit to too little, you could have gotten a lower price. So it's a little bit on the tricky side. So transit is a very easy thing to do. It's very inexpensive to do. Why do you need this peering thing, particularly when you look at the math and you say, 100 gigabits per second at $4 a meg is $400,000 per month. It's actually pretty inexpensive when you compare the alternative of peering. So let's talk about peering. Peering is defined as a reciprocal relationship whereby two ISPs exchange access to each other's customers. Okay, so in this example, we have a blue ISP and a red ISP. And these guys are both paying transit fees to get access to the global internet, including to each other. What they do is they recognize that and they say, hey, red ISP, maybe I can peer directly with you and exchange access to my customers for access to your customers, and therefore bypass that transit wheel, that money wheel that we're both paying to get access to each other. Now, there is a cost associated with peering, so that needs to go into the calculation to determine if it's financially reasonable to go into an exchange point and exchange that traffic with each other for free. That's part of the math that people end up doing. So there's really, what I've seen in the research I've done, three reasons that come up for peering. The first is the cost savings potential, as I described earlier. When the cost of sending traffic to your transit provider is more expensive than the traffic of going into an exchange point and peering that traffic for free, when you do the math, you end up doing peering along with some transit. So the cost savings is a motivator. But a lot of people today especially point out that it's not just a function of cost. Mostly I hear this from the content guys. Yahoo and Microsoft and Google say, the most important thing, Bill, is not the cost savings, but it's the end user experience. Are there content providers here in the audience? How many of you guys would say that's really a primary motivation for peering? Let's see how the financial crisis bears out, is Steve's comment. Yeah, good point. There's a third reason that came up that I found fascinating, and this is actually a bit contentious. So if you want to know what gets discussed at peering forums, this third point is actually one of them. The argument is that, this first came out of Dave Rand from AboveNet's mouth. He said, we believe we make more money by peering. Really? How do you make more money by peering? He said, well, the faster the TCP window opens up and the less packet loss there is, the more traffic that gets sent to us. And since we charge based upon the 95th percentile traffic that comes to us, by managing our peering interconnects and decreasing the latency and decreasing the packet loss, the windows open up faster, and therefore we have more traffic and we make more money. What do you guys think?
Hey, Bill?
Yeah.
There's another, I'm Patrick from Akamai. There's another actual, perhaps more important effect, is when people go to a web page, if it takes 10 seconds to download, they tend to go away from that web page.
End user performance.
Yes. So the performance benefits equal money, because first of all, if you're a retailer, you get more click-throughs, you get more actual, they call them conversions when somebody actually buys something. But even if you're just a content provider charging on megabytes or megabits or whatever you're charging on, people stay on the page longer, they look at more things, they download more videos, et cetera, and so you make more money that way. This, of course, doesn't apply to somebody like Yahoo, YouTube, who doesn't charge per video, but it applies to just about anybody else who's charging their customers based on traffic.
Good point. Igor?
Igor with Yahoo. another huge advantage here is resiliency. Instead of having just one person, transit provider, they have a problem, tons of your traffic has a really bad day. If you have a couple hundred peers, one of them has a problem, well, that's 1/200 of your traffic that's having a bad day.
Along those lines, control also came up. The ability to detect there's loss along this path, so let's turn off this peering session and turn up this peering session. That's control you have that you don't have if you're just sending your traffic to a transit provider. So that came up also from actually Yahoo. Richard wants to blast me.
Hi, Richard Steenbergen, Inlayer. The point that I always made to Dave Fran that I don't think he understood was that he wasn't seeing packet loss, he was seeing a shorter AS path, and therefore all his multi-home customers now, without tuning anything or really having an idea of what traffic they were sending, it now looked like a shorter path, and that was what he was actually seeing, and not, there's only so much packet loss out there, and if you're actually seeing packet loss, you're going to know it, and you're going to know it pretty quickly.
Thank you for that.
Hi, Guy from Limelight. There definitely is a degree of what Richard was saying with the shorter AS path, but we also have noticed that that there are the TCP windowing that you were talking about, where if you turn up to an eyeball network, for example, that only has traffic destined to them, the traffic levels are actually higher when you have the direct connection to them, and theoretically it's because it doesn't have to transit through as many devices, and you have the better connectivity. So there's definitely that for the carrier side, where all of a sudden the AS path matters, but there's also the TCP issue. So they're both a factor.
That was actually a fascinating effect. The peering coordinators told me was they might do the math and see that they have, say, 30 megabits per second on a 45 meg pipe. And when they turn on the peering, it ends up bursting up a bit higher than the anticipated traffic because that path ends up being preferred, probably for the AS path reason that Richard's going to bring up now.
No, the reason that they're seeing that is they're doing their calculation based on net flow. And what they're looking at, when you see paths through the internet via BGP, you only see the best path. You don't see all your possible paths. So when you turn up a direct connection, you end up statistically seeing a lot more paths than you do if you're looking at them behind a transit provider, because any people's customers also connect to other providers. Most of the internet is multi-home, so you're seeing more paths. There's nothing about going through more routers that causes TCP to slow down. That's garbage.
Interesting. This is why I do the stepwise refinement on the white papers. That's a great point, Richard. Thank you. Okay, so there are two key points that need to be made about peering. First is that peering is not transitive. And what I mean by that is if a blue ISP, let's see, I think I skipped forward. Okay, I think the picture will come up in a second. If a blue ISP, whatever. Peering is not transitive. If two ISPs are peering with each other and the middle ISP has a peering relationship with somebody else, it does not imply that these two endpoints can go through the middle guy to get to the top guy. Peering is not a transitive relationship. And as such, peering is not a perfect substitute for transit. Does that make sense? Particularly for those people who are just getting introduced to these topics, it is very important that you acknowledge that point. Peering and transit are two fundamentally different things. Okay, so let's take a look at this last piece here. I'm going to introduce how these definitions fit into the global internet peering ecosystem. First, the definition. I call a global internet peering ecosystem as a set of interconnected individual ecosystems. And if you squint and call an internet ecosystem a country, you wouldn't be too far off. Within each of these ecosystems, from my research, I've seen that there are essentially three different categories of species in the ecosystem. You typically have what I call Tier 1 ISPs, and I'm recapturing this definition. Tier 2 ISPs and content providers. And we're going to talk about each one of these individual species that you see in each one of these internet regions in the global internet peering ecosystem. The first one's a Tier 1 ISP, and I'm recapturing this definition. A Tier 1 ISP, in my terms, is an ISP that has access to the entire internet region solely through its peering relationships. That is, by definition, a Tier 1 ISP does not buy transit from anybody in order to get to all the destinations within that internet region. As a result, the motivation for a Tier 1 ISP is to not peer with anybody else, to not buy transit from anybody else, but really to protect that marketplace that they pretty much own. So their motivation is not to peer, and this is articulated in a restrictive peering policy. Essentially, the answer to a peering request is no. Tier 2 ISPs are everybody else in the internet peering ecosystem in that region that have to buy transit from somebody in order to get access to some part of the internet region. As a result, these guys have the motivation to peer to reduce their transit fees. As a result of that, the motivation in the Tier 2 crowd is to peer away as much traffic as possible, or peer away traffic that makes sense for them based upon performance or financial reasons. You tend to see here a selective peering policy, which means we want to peer with you, but you need to meet some prerequisites, or an open peering policy, which means we will peer with anybody. This is what Yahoo and most of the content guys do. This is what a lot of the Tier 2 guys end up doing. We will peer openly with anybody. These folks are affectionately referred to as peering sluts. The third category are content providers. These are guys who do not sell internet transit in the region. They're primarily focused on generating the content, and as a result, their traffic and their dollars end up going up in the peering ecosystem. They generally will be seen as having a no peering policy, meaning we don't peer. We simply buy transit. Why bother doing anything else? So you tie all these things together and you have the ecosystem over here. And it's interesting to note that every ecosystem I've studied is pretty much like what you see over here. The traffic ends up flowing up or within these individual clouds, in some cases between the Tier 2 ISPs and the content providers. But the nice thing to be, if you're a Tier 1, is a lot of this traffic ends up going up and a lot of the dollars end up going up. You're pretty much ruling the roost if you're a Tier 1 ISP by these definitions. Okay, so let's take a quick quiz and migrate over to Kevin's piece. Come on. Did this thing freeze? Patrick, Macs are not perfect.
You got too many spinning dials. They're causing me to go.
Okay, let me try doing that. Too many spinning dials. Okay, who can tell me the definition of transit? Just shout it out. Full table. The definition of peering? No, not partial table. You could have partial transit. What's the definition of peering? What?
It's not a truck. It's tubes.
Agreement between two providers to exchange tables of their customers and their NID space.
Excellent. The definition of an open peering policy. Very good. Yes. Definition of a selective peering policy. Maybe. Definition of a restrictive peering policy.
Actually, selective peering policy is no when I don't want to say that to you.
This is one of the conversations that does also happen in the peering forums. Okay, and here we have a sample peering ecosystem that consists of two Tier 1 ISPs within one internet region, ISP X and ISP Y. ISP X has a downstream ISP called ISP A, ISP Y is a Tier 1 ISP who has a downstream called ISP B. ISP B in this ecosystem has a content provider customer at the bottom. You see the dollars indicate who is getting paid for the traffic that gets sent through this ecosystem. So let's ask a couple of questions. What's going to happen when ISP B asks for peering from ISP Y? What's the answer going to be? I couldn't hear. Why will it be no? Because he'll be losing money. That's right. He prefers the dollars that he's getting from the traffic that is going through that particular pipe. So the answer will most likely be no. What happens when the content provider who's downstream says, I'm not one of your customers, will you peer with me? What's the answer likely to be? Who says yes? Can you tell me why? Hey, do you want to use the microphone or?
We've actually experienced this before. We've had like content providers come to us because, and vice versa. We like it because we can offload instead of have to go through a tier 2 and get an exchange of or a payment arrangement between the two. So we'll just it's really a way to offload traffic that would otherwise have to go through another ISP.
It's a reasonable argument, but in the research I've done, it very, very rarely happens. In fact, I've not heard of it happening.
We're a university, so our customers are university, and they want to get to these peer-to-peer networks.
Universities and government types have kind of special status, but typically the answer will be no for two reasons. One is I do see dollars from your traffic because it goes through the Tier 2 and ultimately through me, and I don't want that wheel to spin any slower. But also because if I peer with you, I'm going to be pissing off my customer because he's not getting that revenue from that peering connection. So how about if ISP A says to ISP Y, I'd like to peer with you? What's the answer likely to be? Yes. Who says yes? Could you explain why?
I would assume that because Tier 1 ISP Y is going to be taking a customer away from X as well as additional income. Whatever ISP A is paying ISP X, he's going to not be paying ISP Y.
A very important point, though. Peering is typically a free relationship. It's a reciprocal exchange of access to each other's customers.
Well,
so there's typically no dollars exchanged in that relationship.
Then ISP Y is going to benefit by taking a customer away from X.
It is true that he will piss off ISP X.
Okay.
He will piss off his peer because his peer won't be getting that additional revenue.
Okay.
What most likely happens in the actual ecosystem is that ISP Y will say, that peering request is a call for help. And we would love to sell you access because we know that ISPX has a lousy network. I understand why you're reaching out. But typically the answer ends up being no. Because we don't need any more peering. This is what Quest used to always tell me. Bill, we don't need any more peering. And they don't. They have access to the entire internet region solely by their free peering relationships. So they don't need any more peering. And what's interesting is I found this consistent across the globe, with actually two exceptions. But I'm already taking too much time. One last question. No, actually, I think that's it. I'm going to skip this next section and get to you. Okay. Go ahead.
I'm not really sure we're all that short on time, but I appreciate Bill making sure I at least get a little time up here to go over my section of this. I call it, it's not all about the money, but in reality, it really is. It's just that it's not all counting the immediate beans that Bill's mostly been talking about. He has talked about a few of the issues I'm going to talk about as well, however. First of all, who am I? Well, as Bill told you, I've been playing around with the network for a lot of years. I was the network manager for the engineering department at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory for quite a number of years, and since 1993 I have been a senior network engineer for ESNet. And that's significant in this particular case because ESNet does a lot of peering. ESNet is a relatively small, non-commercial provider to the U.S. Department of Energy. ESNet has no transit provider. By Bill's definition, we are a Tier 1. We peer with a lot of people, including all of the commonly referred to T1s and a number of folks who may or may not be T1s, depending upon who you believe. But we do a great deal of peering. We have lots and lots of peers, and we appear at lots of peering points for that reason. We need to peer. And as Bill so eloquently described it, we're peering sluts. We'll peer with pretty much anyone. There's been at least one case of a provider who wanted to peer with us, who mostly provided access to Caribbean casinos. And as a government-funded organization, we thought it was probably impolitic to go with that one. So we have turned down at least one peer. And if we find a peer that is sufficiently incompetent, we probably would turn them down too. But that's about the only reasons we would turn somebody down, is either unacceptable overall content. We're not saying that just because they have some unacceptable content to us, we won't peer with you. We will. But it's pretty hard to discourage us from being willing to peer with you. And we do peer with all of the U.S. Tier 1s. ESNet and the two of us at ESNet who are tasked as peering coordinators spend a lot of effort on peering and deal with a lot of peers of all sizes. However, we're non-commercial. We're not in the market of collecting any money from our customers. We get a big check from the government to simply provide them service. So I'm not going to be counting beans. That's what Bill's talk is about. Reasons for peering, obviously, Bill's talked about the financial issues, the trade-offs and the various costs, why it sometimes makes sense to peer financially, sometimes it doesn't. But there are other reasons for peering, that some of which Bill touched on. Reliability is a very critical issue in the network. If your network cannot reliably get your customers' traffic to where they want it to get to, they're going to not be your customers for a whole lot longer. So being able to peer with critical sources of data like Yahoo, Google, CDNs, other big data sources, can be very useful. And it is useful to them too. They want their content to get to you as quickly and as smoothly as possible. So frequently they're very willing to peer at the various peering points. Another thing is sites of particular import to your customers. For example, your customer buys commercial backup service from a major data warehousing firm. And that firm happens to be 7 AS hops away, and periodically something hiccups and their backups get messed up and they get very annoyed. Well, if you can peer directly with either the content provider, or I should say the backup provider, or their ISP, you suddenly cut that much, much shorter and your reliability goes up a lot. And that could make a difference between keeping a customer and losing a customer. Another significant issue, which people tend to overlook, is faster problem resolution. Now, this may have been a unique thing to Colorado, where I grew up. I don't know, but I don't know if any of you ever played the game of hippopotamus at a birthday party when you were about 9 or 10 years old, or if you can remember when you were 9 or 10 years old for that matter. That's the game where you get everybody lined up and whisper a long word in the ear of the kid next to you, and he whispers what he heard to the kid next to him, and it goes down the line through all the party attendees, and whatever comes out at the other end seldom has any similarity at all to the word that went in the first ear. And that's what happens when you have 3 or 4 providers that your trouble ticket has to work its way through. Every one of them passes it along, and people misunderstand, and of course, because the person passing it along isn't really familiar with the problem, he doesn't explain it effectively, and by the time he gets to the end, they say, that's just ridiculous. That can't possibly be a problem, and forgets all about it. Your problem doesn't get resolved quickly. If you're pairing with somebody, you can talk directly to the people there. The odds of having a communications problem are greatly reduced, and the mean time to repair is a whole lot better. That translates to happier customers. Well, let's get down to the nuts and bolts of pairing. You've looked at the expenses, the business case. You've decided that peering is something you want to do for whatever reason. So what do you do next? Well, peering is a social activity. It's somewhat akin to dating, for example. Maybe not quite as much fun, but it has certain similarities. First, you need to find somebody to peer with. You need to make contact with them, and you need to convince them that peering with you is a good idea. There's sort of a meet and greet and wooing stage that goes along through here. So the first thing you got to do is communicate with your potential peers. That means sometimes you're working with competitors. Peering within a small market area is frequently very beneficial because a lot of your traffic may stay local to that area, and so you can offload your transit by a significant amount in some cases. So talking to your peers is good, and it's convenient that a lot of the smaller local exchange points provide a good opportunity to do exactly that, and most of those are actually pretty inexpensive to work with as well. Decisions on whether to peer with somebody are often as much personal as business. If somebody's been annoying you, you're probably not going to want to peer with them, and you'll probably just sort of ignore their queries. You don't necessarily get a lot of no's back, you just get dead silence back. If you don't take the initiative and contact people, it's just like if you're interested in getting into the dating scene and you don't ever put yourself out there where people know who you are and see you. If you don't take the initiative, nothing's ever going to happen. And of course, you need to be receptive to the interests of others. It is a two-way street. So who makes a good prospect for peering? Well, Google and Yahoo are at just about every peering point in the world and are generally very receptive to peering, as are a number of heavy content providers. They're looking for eyeballs. If you've got eyeballs, they probably want to talk to you. And if they're at the exchange point where you're located, the odds of being able to peer with them are probably pretty good. I have heard from Igor that Yahoo actually has de-peered somebody, but boy, they had to work at it. The other folks who make good prospects, local providers. Yes, they're your competitors, but they can also be your partners. And by cooperating with one another, both parties can come out ahead. That's really the whole point of peering. It becomes a cooperative effort to the benefit of both. If it doesn't benefit both parties, probably it's not going to happen. But once you're at an exchange point, once you're connected to the fabric, almost anybody you can peer with is worth considering, because once you buy the connection, the peering is basically free. That is, for many definitions of free. It still takes some manpower. It takes a little care and feeding, and if it's competently run, very little care and feeding. But it doesn't cost very much to peer once you're on the fabric. Okay, well, how do you find peers? First of all, you're here at NANOG, and that's a really good start because most of the people you want to peer with either are here or somebody who's here knows those people, and that's really handy. You want to go to the peering BOF. That's its major purpose, is to let people who are interested in peering make contact with one another. Meet people. Talk to people in the back of the room, in the hallways, at breakfast. That's a wonderful opportunity to get to know people and make contact. If people recognize your name, know who you are, they're going to be much more receptive to your peering requests. It just works that way. Another thing you can do is get a list of the people who are available for peering at your peering location. All of the major exchange providers have this list of all the other folks there, and that gives you the information on how to contact them. And you want to take a look at these things and prioritize them based on the amount of bandwidth you expect to be able to exchange with them. After all, the more bandwidth you can offload from your transit, the more money you can save there. And how important those people are to your customers. Is it going to benefit them substantially and therefore benefit you substantially? And of course, finally, you need to make contact with them, which means you've got to find the right person. Number one place to look. I'd like to say the peering BOF, but it's not. It's the peering DB. That's where people who want to peer put out their information, let you know who the contact is, how to contact them, what their basic peering information is. If you're not interested in peering, you may not be in the peering DB, but if you are, you really need to be there. It's free, it doesn't cost you anything. Go there, put your information in there. It's a good way to get contact with people who want to peer. The Exchange Point web pages have information on potential peers. The Exchange Points typically have mailing lists you can send to. Don't expect great return from this, but it doesn't hurt anything. Just don't annoy people. Face-to-face, that's really high on the list. Look around you, look for people who might be interested in peering with, and talk to them. There's no better opportunity than when you're right here at NANOG for that sort of face-to-face introduction, and it's probably the most effective way to get people to peer. In fact, I've set up a new peering with somebody right here since I got to NANOG. Actually, two peerings with them, one for IPv4 and one for IPv6. And we don't set up a lot of IPv6 peerings, so that's really good news for us. And introductions. Work with your colleagues. The people you know people you don't know, so they can get you together with them. Once again, it's a very social operation. Once you've made contact, you've got to work the sale. You've got to do the wooing. First of all, when you send out cold messages, don't expect a huge response, but since peering costs almost nothing, any return at all is a win. However, you don't want to send out repeated cold messages. That just annoys people and probably guarantees they're never going to peer with you, and maybe just puts you in their kill file and they never see your mail again. So stick to one mail message to any provider, at least at first. However, you can follow up in other ways and places, like here at NANOG. You can be imaginative in your approach, but don't be so imaginative you're irritating to people. And if in doubt, ask someone you know and trust if this approach seems reasonable to them. If they say, "Oh, geez, that's awful," probably you don't want to do it. You need to sell yourself as a peer. What are your assets you provide as a peer? And get a look at those honestly. Why would you want to peer with you might be a good place to start. What do you have that would make you as a potential peer interested in peering with you? Well, everybody in these things tends to exaggerate a little bit, just, like when you're dating or something. You still don't want to flat out make untrue claims. People are going to notice before long, and that will have very bad long-term effects. Don't boast, be friendly. You need to both sound and be competent. No peer is happy if they have to babysit the peering all the time. You need to have something that can be brought up and run and basically need very little attention, because once you start taking an engineer's time, it's costing money, and suddenly free isn't free anymore. And also keep it low-key. This is not high-pressure sales time. You're not selling used cars. So don't push really hard. Once again, you annoy people. Common prerequisites for peering. And none of these are things that all sites or all peers will have, or even most peers, but there are things that are commonly required by people for peering. Top of the list is a 24/7 knock. Many ISPs say, if you don't have a 24/7 knock where we can contact you when there's a problem anytime, we're not going to deal with you. So that's really very important. Many require multiple peerings in geographically diverse locations. Those are going to be the more national operations, of course. And if they do that, they're probably going to insist that the announcements be consistent across all of the peering points. They're going to want to peer with you as a single AS. If they're peering with you as multiple ASs, it makes peering much more complicated and probably makes them suspicious that you may not exactly have the best run network in the world. They may have traffic volume minimums. Many of them have very high traffic volume minimums. Those are called tier 1s, by the way. But some of the smaller networks still have some substantial traffic volume minimums to peer with them. And of course, the last point, which Bill mentioned too, you must not be their customer. They're not going to give you something that you're already paying for. It just doesn't work well for the bottom line. Just because you don't have all those, don't assume that people are going to refuse to peer with you. Very few of the networks, except for the tier 1s, have all of those requirements. Most of them have only a few. Some may have none. It never hurts to ask, even if they do have those requirements. Some are rather flexible, and some are, of course, inflexible, particularly the bigger operations. If you have something a potential peer wants good access to, your odds are even better. Be realistic, though. It's not likely that you have anything on your network that's going to make a tier 1 want to bend its rules and peer with you. It's just almost certainly not going to happen. And I say almost because, after all, we do peer with all the T1s, but tier 1s rather. But if you're a commercial provider, your odds are a whole lot worse than mine would have been. And really try to avoid mistakes that could hurt your network's reputation. AS 7007 will live in infamy for a great many years, and that's the sort of thing you don't want attached to your name. So be careful not to try to blow up the internet routing table by some mistake. It's really a bad thing to do. Another issue is peering agreements. That's a legal issue, and I'll start off by saying I am not a lawyer, so I'm not going to give any legal advice whatsoever. Most providers, however, do not require them. We have very few peering agreements among our 100 and some odd peers around the country. If somebody wants peering, if your lawyers, your boss, whatever, insists there be a peering agreement, take a look at the exchange's standard agreements. Most exchanges have them, and it makes it much easier to get agreement from the other side, eliminates negotiation. The bigger owners, the bigger providers, that means they have in-house lawyers, and that means they are more likely to have a peering agreement. Of course, that means your lawyers have to get involved, and if you don't have a lawyer on your staff, that means you've actually got to pay one or sign something that you may come to regret later. I'll leave that one up to you. Once again, I'm not a lawyer. So if you absolutely need a custom agreement, though, try to keep it as simple as your lawyer will let you, or perhaps their lawyer will let you. It's not all about BGP, but most of it is. You need to know and understand BGP issues. If you're not familiar with BGP, and I mean very familiar with it, I strongly urge you to go to one of Phil Smith's excellent BGP tutorials here at NANOG, which, because of the conflict with the New Zealand NOG meeting, Phil's not teaching this time, but I'm sure will be again in the future. Absolutely worth attending if you're not really comfortable with BGP. And have handy all the information needed for peering, all of which will go in the peering DB if you register there. Your ASN, peering address, contact information, any exchange-specific information such as VLAN ID or PVC. We don't do ATM anymore, though, so forget about the PVC one. Peering agreement procedures, if you really need one, and a list of other peering locations that you might be available at. Finally, there are basically three types of connections that you're going to run into at an exchange. The most common one, the one you probably mostly care about, is fabric peering. It's free, and did I mention it's free? That's a very strong argument for it. It's fast and easy to set up. It's most likely to get a favorable response. Second connection is a private VLAN. It doesn't require a separate interface, but it is a VLAN that connects directly to your peer. This usually means you're going to have a recurring monthly charge for that VLAN that the exchange operator is going to charge you. So it's definitely not free anymore. Plus, there's usually a fairly significant setup charge to create the or the VLAN in the first place. It's pretty easy to set up and pretty easy to run, but in most cases, you'll find that financially it's probably not worth it to pay that expense. The third kind is the one you're least likely to use. That's a private connection. That means you've got an interface, they've got an interface, and you run fiber or copper between the two. Many large providers only support this type of connection. It's awfully expensive, and because it not only costs the price of the interconnect, the monthly recurring charge for standing there and not ripping your interconnect out, and it takes up a router port. Router ports aren't free last time I looked, and if they're very large router ports, it can get kind of pricey. It's most expensive, hardest to justify. But if you decide to do it, the question is, who pays for it? And this is subject to negotiation, but if you're doing multiple peerings, general rule of thumb is one side pays for the first peering, the other side pays for the second, and so on, so that everybody pays for half the cost of those peerings. Still, those are kind of pricey and probably not things you're going to want to do. So there gives you a general overview of the mechanics of getting peering going on a social basis and how to decide who to look to peer, where you've got a chance, and whether you've got a chance. Because you've got to decide all these things before you pay the expense of putting a router at an inter-exchange location and pulling bandwidth into that location, because that's a fair chunk of change right there. You want to have a pretty good idea you're going to come out ahead in the long term. Don't look necessarily just at tomorrow, but make sure in the long term you're going to come out ahead before you spend those bucks. After all, transit these days, as Bill pointed out, is getting awfully cheap, even if it is ridiculous. And now on to Bill for the wrap-up here. Or going back to the section you skipped, whichever.
Yeah, I think that probably makes sense to do, since we seem to have some more time.
I promised you 20 minutes, Bill. I did it.
Thank you very much. Actually, that's kind of an impressive thing. Very rarely do people come in under the amount of time.
All afternoon we've been under the time, Bill. We're on a roll.
Okay. So let's take a look at what has happened in the U.S. peering ecosystem. Recall I was speaking about the Tier 1 ISPs, by my definition, the Tier 2s and the Tier 3s. Well, back in, I guess around 2001, the primary upstream ISP for the cable companies in the United States, called At Home, went bankrupt. Now all of a sudden, all the cable companies in the United States needed to fend for themselves from an internet provider perspective. They needed to go buy the solutions for handling email. They needed to operate their own backbones and have on-call staff and really build things up on a matter of 60 days notice, maybe even less. So around that time, there was a key evolution in the U.S. internet peering ecosystem where the cable companies started peering. Remember I said 3 types of groups, the ISP, the Tier 1 ISP organism, the Tier 2 ISP organism, and the content provider. Well, the cable companies in my ecosystem became a separate type of species. And they're a separate type of species because the volume of traffic these guys were doing back in 2001 compared to the volume of traffic for the entire ecosystem was enormous. And these cable companies came into this ecosystem with a completely open peering policy. They'll peer with anybody. At the time, Kazaa represented about 40% to 60% of all of the cable company traffic. This is that file sharing protocol that was in place around 2001. Eventually it got shut down by the government, but again, 40 to 60% of the cable company's traffic or so was peer-to-peer traffic, ultimately destined to the other cable companies in the peering ecosystem. But initially it was going through the transit provider. So they could save 40 to 60% on their transit bill simply by peering with each other. So this represented an enormous change in the ecosystem because the cable company to cable company traffic no longer went through Sprint and Unet and those guys. Now it was peered directly with each other. So that represented a tremendous change in the internet region. The second change that we saw in the ecosystem was when the largest content providers in the world got into the ecosystem and said, hey, you know what? We do send a lot of transit traffic to upstream ISPs, but I think there's some value in us peering with the Tier 2 ISPs, and I think the Tier 2 ISPs might be receptive to peering directly with us because we have such a large amount of traffic destined to their customers. We'll save money, and the Tier 2 ISPs save money. And this is a key point, the very successful content providers that adopted this strategy made it very clear to the Tier 2 ISP, we will never buy transit from you. There is no loss of revenue potential by you peering with me because if you peer with me, you'll save money, I'll save money. If you peer with me or don't peer with me, it has no implications on transit. I will never buy transit from you. And because of that, we started seeing a lot of these content guys, the very large ones, getting into the peering ecosystem and evolving themselves from the traditional content providers. In fact, an interesting data point. I asked the ISPs and the content guys, what do you do to analyze your traffic flow? Who do you think did the most detailed analysis of where their traffic was going to and coming from? Shout out a name of an ISP or a content guy. Yes? Google? Well, this was back in 2002, 2003. Yahoo was the answer, actually. Back then, it was interesting. Igor's team at Yahoo was doing by far the most detailed, in-depth analysis of where their traffic was going to. I asked the Tier 2 guys, how about the Tier 1 guys? Aren't they doing a detailed analysis of where the traffic's going to? But the problem with the Tier 1 guys typically was that they had so much legacy equipment that was not capable of providing the statistics on end-to-end flows that they could not get a global picture as to where things were going to or coming from. The content guys, on the other hand, had access to the entire TCP stack, and when they saw session resets or packet loss, they could narrow it down to which path was being used, which transit path or which peering path was being used when those packets were dropped, so they could adjust the traffic on the fly as they needed to. I talked to some other large Tier 2 ISPs, and they said, yeah, we analyze the traffic once a month. We'll do the net flow analysis. We'll run a script on a big Sunbox that will crank over the weekend, and if the script doesn't crash, we'll get a top AS list and figure out who we ought to be going after for peering. But that's way different, a much larger scale than the granularity of Yahoo saying, we know when packets are dropped and what path they were going across in order to have that packet loss happen. So I thought that was fascinating. The content guys, like Yahoo, were doing by far the most detailed, in-depth analysis of traffic flow. They have an incentive. It's the end user experience that they're focusing on. The third evolution in the ecosystem was when the cable companies started peering directly with the large-scale content guys. And this is a significant evolution because, again, collectively, this is an enormous amount of traffic, and that traffic is, of course, growing over time. All this traffic was being diverted away from the traditional path, which was directly to the Tier 1 ISPs or via the Tier 2 ISPs to the Tier 3 ISPs or cross sessions of peering at the Tier 2 level. So these links, this interconnection in the middle of this cloud ended up being an enormously impactful change to the traditional internet peering ecosystem. Does that make sense? So along the lines of what Kevin was doing a little bit, what are the conversations that happen at GPF? These are some of the ones that you're going to hear. I think a lot of the folks who has this as the first NANOG that they're attending? Raise your hand. Okay, and how many of you guys are going to the GPF? Okay, perfect. Some of the conversations that you're going to hear coming up are these. Does peering really make sense anymore? That, I put to you, that has always been a valid question. Does peering make sense? With the price of transit at $4 a meg and dropping down, we're predicting what? $1.20 a meg. Why not use transit? Please, I'd like to open it up to discussion. Should we shut down the peering points? Stephen Wilcox.
Hi, Bill.
Hey.
Isn't the cost of peering in transit largely defined by the cost of transporting bits from A to B? So aren't both a function of the transport? So if that's coming down, then the cost of transit's coming down to these crazy levels. But by contrast, isn't also the cost of peering coming down as well? So it's always cheaper at a certain level.
I was just told that the price of 10 gig ports at a large U.S.-based exchange point is $2,500 now. And the price used to be around $12,000 in the U.S. Yes, that's a tremendous drop. In Europe, of course, the prices of exchange point services have always been substantially lower, primarily because you guys in Europe have your exchange points as not-for-profit kind of association-based models, as opposed to the U.S., where we're typically commercial-based exchanges. Do you want to?
Well, you kind of made the thing there about the costs driving it as well. The other thing I was going to say is, I mean, you can't have a market that's based purely out of transit because somebody has to buy from somebody else. So there's always a level at which some people are not buying from each other anyway. So it's just a threshold, right?
I think there's always going to be a transit service. I mean, you could go to the key regions around the world and peer as much of that traffic away as you can, but for those destinations you can't reach, you're always going to be buying transit from somebody to get access to some part of the internet. Just financially, it makes a lot more sense to use transit providers for those faraway places that are tough to get to. Again, these are the conversations that are going to come up around the bar when you go to the GPF. Just talking with the Netflix guys, you know, one of the trade-offs is, do we use a CDN? Do we buy transit? Do we use transit and peering, or do we use this peer-to-peer stuff? This is a conversation that is very much on the top of the minds of the peering coordinator guys. How many people have changed from their view on peering to now saying, peering doesn't make any more sense, I'm just going to use transit or CDN? Raise your hands. Nobody.
The question, Bill, is why try to frame this in sort of a binary way? Why try to say peering makes sense or transit makes sense? There's economics at work here. There'll always be a point at which it makes sense to peer. There'll always be a point at which it makes sense to buy transit. It depends on your footprint. It depends on the pricing. It depends on, you know, if you need to buy colo anyway and you're in an Equinix facility or Interaction or someplace there's a peering point, you're of course going to be more inclined to peer because your economic threshold for peering is lower.
So do you believe it's a one-off decision?
No, it's not a one-off decision.
Or is it a global decision? We are going to do peering and CDN.
Again, I think that's really binary. I think the much better way of doing it is to take a more nuanced approach. I mean, there are plenty of folks who have lots and lots of peering but still choose to buy transit in a few places, as you said, because it makes sense to do. I think when you're talking about the amount of money with a big global network that you're talking about, let's say you're a CDN or let's say you're a hosting provider, and that's a great example of someone who has a peering versus transit decision. I think it requires a lot more expertise and a lot more ambiguity than this sort of ascribes to it. I think there's always a mix that is appropriate, and at the end of the day, this is a spreadsheet exercise.
I absolutely agree with you. I think there's always going to be a blend of peering and something else for ISPs who decide to peer. I'm talking more about the content guys who have kind of done the math and said, we've eased into this, we've gone to the 3 locations, we meet the peering prerequisites, but, the story I hear every single time that I have this discussion is when you look at the graph that shows the amount of traffic going to different ASs, it's always the tier 1 guys or the cable guys that are in that top, 30, 40, 50% of my traffic, maybe even more than that. And then it's that long tail that they try and say, I might be able to peer that traffic away. How much will it cost me to peer that traffic away? And increasingly, the answer seems to be it's making less and less sense.
It doesn't make much sense to peer with a long tail. It only makes sense to peer with, your big traffic sources and sinks as a general rule, unless you're peering anyway. You're buying an exchange port anyway. Then it makes sense to just sort of go crazy. But at the end of the day, the other thing to keep in mind here is, there was a time when, yes, most of people's traffic was going to a quote-unquote tier 1, a settlement-free interconnection network. But that's been shifting. I mean, Sprint and AboveNet and those sorts of networks are no longer the huge traffic sources and sinks they once were. I mean, Verizon is still a huge traffic source and sink, not because of 701, but because of the broadband. So I think there has been a big shift there to keep in mind.
So the tier 1s are still shrinking in significance in the ecosystem, you believe?
I believe so.
I hear Comcast coming up as, in fact, that's sort of the other premise. Again, these are the conversations you're going to hear around the bar. Might it be the case that the cable companies, the last mile guys in the ecosystem, become the new dominant players where the relative, the old tier 1 crowd are relatively insignificant? They'll get your traffic to New Zealand or someplace far away like that, but ultimately maybe it'll be the cable companies that are far more powerful and important in the ecosystem.
You act like that's new. That's not what's coming up, Bill. That's what's already happened. Think of all the tier 1s that you know in the United States. Well, most of the tier 1s are United States. All the ones that are still relevant and important because people like Savvis, honestly, are just not that important if you look at your traffic graphs. The ones who are either owned by or own a broadband provider. Verizon, AT&T, NTT America. I like to call them Vario, but Jared will throw something at me. And people like that. So it's too late. The tier 1s already do not matter. If you look at AS3356, it has trivial amount of traffic compared to the downstream cone of AS3356.
So in my picture there, that middle blob where the cable companies are pairing with the content companies and the tier 2 ISPs, are you suggesting that is far larger in volume than perhaps the traffic going and traversing the tier 1s?
Yes. I'm not suggesting that. Would anybody like to argue otherwise in the entire room? There are lots of people who, like to argue things here. Is anyone here not think that there is more traffic on AS-to-AS edges that do not include transit-free networks as opposed to AS-to-AS edges where at least one of them is transit-free? Put simply another way, does anybody think there's more traffic through the tier 1s, or do they think most of the traffic is flattened out?
But Patrick, the problem is the AT&T and Verizon broadband. You have to kind of take that away.
Yeah, no, I'm specifically only including, 701 counts as a tier 1, 19262 does not.
It depends on the size of your network. If you're a small regional player, there's a good chance you're going to see most of the internet behind tier 1s. If you're a big global player, then there's a good chance they're not very important.
No, I meant globally. Total amount of traffic on the internet, however many, gigajoules or whatever there are. Nobody knows? Does anybody have an idea, or do you not agree with me, or you have no idea what I asked?
I think it's a great question. I think the difficulty is going to be, as Dan says, teasing out what you're calling the eyeball cable companies, broadband networks, or whatever, away from the tier 1 guys. And then, of course, measuring the data is kind of a tricky thing since no one really wants to disclose traffic patterns these days.
Okay. Well, all of the large traffic sources are pretty well known. People like Microsoft, Akamai, Limelight, Google, Yahoo. You can name them off the top of your head, and all of them are very clear about the fact that most of their traffic does not go to a tier 1 AS. When the traffic leaves their AS, it does not go to a tier 1 AS. So I would say that, at least from the traffic source perspective, that's absolutely true. I can't speak for the broadband networks if they're pulling all their traffic from tier 1s.
Peter Cohen wants to make a comment.
Yeah, I might want to add that tomorrow on the peering BOF, we have some results that were done anonymously for more than 100 networks on where their traffic actually does go. So we do have some limited data that we'll be sharing tomorrow. So tune in.
Excellent. So we can argue about that.
So I thought it raised an interesting question as well, though, Bill, which was your peering ecosystem has always been based around peering and transit. But you asked an interesting question when you mentioned CDNs like Akamai and Limelight. Those guys have become specialists in recent years at having presence all around the world. And there's some parts of the world which are extremely difficult and extremely expensive to go into. Even if you're a large network in Europe, America, or somewhere, there's places that are just hard for you to get into. So I think you might want to watch another aspect of the peering ecosystem, which is the cost of offloading some of your traffic to CDNs, so you end up with a blend of transit, peering, and CDN.
I think that's an excellent point, especially as CDNs are carrying just an enormous volume of traffic. I don't have CDNs in this diagram at all. That's a mistake. You're right. Okay, I see no more questions. Do you guys want to talk about exchange points? What do you say?
Yeah, we got 20 minutes. Why not?
Okay. Okay, so Internet exchange points are one mechanism for interconnecting networks. Back around 1994, 1995, in the U.S., that's pretty much the way that the Internet evolved from the NSFNet backbone into the commercial Internet. ISPs competed and connected up their networks together at these network access points, also known as exchange points. And about a year, 2 years later, Tier 1 started pulling out of exchange points, calling them congestion points, because the pairing was primarily done over public switch fabrics or over ATM services that were fairly expensive, and they privately peered among themselves within a metro region. So those are two alternative ways of peering. Peer privately outside an exchange point using point-to-point circuits, or peer within an exchange point where you have the choice of privately peering or peering across a peering fabric. As I'm saying that, I'm recognizing too that Stephen Wilcox will probably mention that across Europe you'll peer across a public peering fabric spread across a geographic metro area. That's a slightly different model, and we'll talk about that in just a second too. But primarily within an exchange point or outside of the exchange point. Primarily in the U.S. and I guess across Europe as well, you're seeing much more of the peering happening within the exchange point than outside the exchange point. Check me if I'm wrong on that. Okay. Okay, so one of the features about exchange points is that all exchange points demonstrate what economists call network externality. Does anyone know what network externality is? Network externality is an economist term that means the value of the product or service is proportional to the number of other people using that product or service. So applied to exchange points, if you have an exchange point that has nobody in it, 0 participants, the value of that exchange point to the community is 0. If you have 1 person in an exchange point, what's the value of the exchange point? Zero, because there's nobody to talk to, there's nobody to peer with. But if you get two people into an exchange point, now two ISPs or a content guy and an ISP can exchange traffic, so now there's some value in being at that exchange point, namely the value of peering that traffic away or buying or selling transit in that location. You get that third party in, and now these two guys can talk with this one guy, and the one guy can talk to two guys. The value goes even further. In fact, if you generalize that, an exchange point value can be metered, or the value can be metered by n participants being able to peer with n-1 other participants. You divide that by 2 because you don't want to count both sides of the relationship twice. But the point is you have an exponential value of the exchange point as more and more people build into the exchange point. You tend to see the value of an exchange point leveling off when you reach capacity because there are no more additional people that can build into the exchange point, so the exponential growth can't grow any further. But you do have the ability to increase the size of the pipes between the participants at the exchange point. So it tends to kind of look roughly like that. Now, people can extend this growth curve by doing the European model and getting another co-location center that's connected somehow to the original one and get more and more participants to continue that exponential growth, and that's the model that they tend to do. But if you sort of generalize it, it tends to look like this. That horizontal line is the cost of exchange point participation. This is the monthly fees that the colo provider would charge and the exchange point operator would charge in order for you to participate at that pairing point. Now, the crossover point is where the cost of transit exactly equals the cost of peering at that exchange point. That's where an ISP will be indifferent between simply buying transit from an upstream and building into the exchange point and paying those fees and then peering traffic away for free with the other participants. But as more and more participants build in the exchange point, more precisely, as more and more unique routes and attractive ISPs and such build in the exchange point, the value of the exchange point grows and grows and grows. And the value can be calculated by measuring the difference between the amount of traffic that you are peering that you would otherwise pay for on a transit relationship and the cost of building in. So you end up charting this out. I think I did the math for the links. And the delta between what links members pay to the links and for co-location fees, it was something like they paid, what, $15,000, Stephen? What's the cost for appearing at the links? Is it £15,000 for the membership fee? $12,000 a year? $2,000 a year. Did that go down substantially?
The membership fee at the links dropped from £2,500 a year to £2,000 a year about 2 months ago. But it's been £2,500 a year for a while now. The membership fee at the links is pretty small, and most other European exchanges don't have a membership fee. So that's not a big deal here.
So what that does to the graph and the value of the exchange point is it drops that horizontal line down, meaning that fewer participants need to be at that exchange in order for it to make financial sense. Does that make sense? So for those of you in a region that's just starting out an exchange point, these are the trade-offs that one has to look at. When you're trying to attract the first few participants, you need to explain to them that the value for the first guys coming in might not be there, but you paint the picture of what's going to be once you get more and more folks into that exchange point. And there are a lot of existence proof points that you can point to demonstrate this. Kind of brings up the key question. I asked the exchange point operators, how do you build critical mass? How do you convince that first ISP to build in? Any answers? Well, in Europe, what they did is the ISPs collectively got together and said, we have aligned interests. We all want to exchange this traffic directly with each other. Let's form an industry association and build that exchange point. And what they tend to do in Europe is have the association operate the exchange fabric and then have a neutrality with what co-location provider are being used to host that facility. So having the ISPs themselves start the exchange point is one model. What commercial IX operators tend to do is identify who are the critical ISPs to get into the exchange point. Who are those that will be a gravitational pull that will make the other folks want to come in and peer at that location? Does that make sense? Again, dropping the price of participation makes the break-even point a bit lower, so that ends up being a good way to do it. Drop the price. The first 5 participants get in at price, 20% of list price, and the next 5 pay 40% of list price, and that's a model that tends to work. Offering equity, that's one of the things, and this is public information, what Equinix did in the early days to get people into Ashburn, because back then, Ras probably remember when nobody was in Ashburn, Virginia? It was an island, and nobody was physically there. We worked with MCI to bring them in. And one of the things that people had done is they would purchase circuits that were transferable to other folks, but another thing that they would do is offer equity. If you build in, we recognize the value of you being in that building will increase the value of the exchange point. So we'll give you a piece of the pie. You can participate in the upside. Note, Stephen, this is something that commercial exchange points can do. In Europe, you tend to have bylaws and a fairly restrictive organization that can't easily adjust prices based on different members, because that would piss off the other members. But commercial entities in the U.S. have a great deal of flexibility to do all these kind of crazy things to build critical mass. Of course, evangelizing and doing peering forums like you guys will go to, I guess, in 2 days. That's a key way to build up the population. You need to get enough people to say, yes, I will build in at the same time to get that critical mass up. Doing one at a time is tough. Get 3 or 4 at a time, much, much easier. So there are 2 dominant models of exchange point systems that I've seen in the world. The first is what I call the links model. And the links model is when you have an exchange point fabric that is separate from the co-location. When I first went to a RITE meeting after Equinix was founded, I talked to folks about Equinix being a carrier-neutral facility. And the Europeans were like, yeah, but you're not co-location neutral. Meaning that you operate the co-location building and the fabric that's inside of it. And that was kind of an interesting difference. So yeah, the Europeans spread their fabric across multiple co-location providers so that an ISP can choose whichever co-location provider fits the needs that they have for security, for access, for where their fiber drops and such. Interesting difference there. Comments? So again, when you come to the neutrality discussion, this often comes up in the peering conversations. There are a variety of different neutralities. There's ISP neutrality, carrier neutrality, and co-location neutrality. In this diagram, the outside triangle is the co-location provider, the physical building in which peering takes place. If you're carrier neutral, what that means is you're attracting multiple carriers into the building to provide transport and fiber into that building. There's also a network externality effect there because carriers don't want to build into a building that has no participants, no tenants. Why would they do that? What they'll say in the early days is we'll build in when we have an order for service, but the ISPs won't come in unless there's some fiber to get them in on, right? So you have to get over that hump and get the carriers in. A carrier-neutral co-location facility will have no backbone that they operate, but they lure in multiple carriers to come in and offer services. An ISP-neutral exchange point is not run by an ISP, but instead encourages multiple ISPs to come in to peer with each other, but also to sell transit to content providers. Level 3 operates the gateway, where really the dominant way of getting into that level 3 gateway is by buying level 3 transit. level 3 capacity. So that's not a carrier neutral. It's not an ISP neutral facility. Anyway, a carrier neutral facility is one where all of these parties are separate entities from the operator of the co-location facility. Make sense? Okay, we already talked about that. So I think now's a good time to wrap it up. If there are any questions, we can entertain those questions or have a discussion, talk about whatever you guys want for the next 6 minutes. I hope this was a useful overview, start the discussion, thoughts going, and we identified the basic concepts in peering. We talked about the basic concepts and definitions of transit and a little bit about the peering ecosystem and the different players and how they act within the ecosystem. And as I said, there's a lot of information on the web. If you Google for my name, you'll find a lot of the white papers, and there's actually a lot more information now in a variety of different sources. Questions? Well, if you don't have any questions, I actually have a couple questions for you guys. Question number 1. Why do some ISPs prefer private peering? Why do some ISPs prefer public peering? Which one is silly? So, Patrick, you work for Akamai. Akamai is a peering slut. You obviously believe in peering. I'm asking, why is there a preference from some ISPs to peer publicly, and why is there a preference from some ISPs to peer privately?
I'm on a roll today, so I figure I'll answer another question.
Great.
So I think ESNet had a slide about this, which is the cost is one major thing. If you want to do public peering, you can show up at an IX, pay your fees, and you can hit a whole lot of traffic out of a port. But if you want to do private peering, you need to order cross-connect. You need to have root support and things in there, and it's usually a lot higher cost. So typically, not always, but once people get into peering, they will normally start with public peering, and then they'll hit a point where they say, well, actually, now this particular large peer, it would be cheaper for me to take this to private. So it's cost.
Did you have an answer?
Yeah, I know this one European network, and from what I remember, their policy was if you were worth peering with, you were worth peering privately with. I think that was what they said.
That sounds like a religious argument, though. Is there technical backing or any logic backing behind that?
I think just greater control over each individual peer and AS number, across the whole gamut of all the connections was it.
Now that one actually came up a lot when I asked this question. I think the Cogent guys put it perfectly. They said, Bill, I can get a 24-port Ethernet, 100 meg at the time, that's what they were pairing with, 100 meg blade, dirt cheap. And if I do that, I can do cross connects over to my peering partner, and I can just do SNMP polls. I don't need any of this net flow crap. I just do some SNMP polls to see where I am on the utilization on a per port, per peer basis. And I can go from 100 to 1 gig when I need to, and it's much simpler. He would argue public peering is for the birds.
Yeah, I can't speak to those guys. I don't know. I think theirs was acquisition.
That's a rational argument, though, isn't it?
Yeah, acquisition of used and lots of equipment from acquisitions, what I think was their plan.
I think Igor was next, and then we'll go to you, Patrick.
So we have a couple of reasons for why we want to do private in some cases, public in others. Link state tracking is a very big thing for us to do private. That's why we do private, because we don't think BFD is quite ready for prime time. And if you care about convergence and faster than BGP sessions timeout, for example, on interface drops, you want to do private. Also, when you do private, there's a much higher likelihood that you actually have visibility of link fullness end-to-end to the peer, versus with a public, yeah, I got 4 gigs of headroom left. They may not.
Patrick?
So I think that this actually goes back to your idea about peering in general. Private peering, public peering, transit, transport, these are all business tools. Unfortunately, people get into religious arguments. Oh, private is better than public. Oh, public is better than private. Reality of the situation is, at least I hope the reality of the situation is, that everybody in this room is here to make money. And the tools you use should either save you or make you money. And if you're not using the right tool, or if you're using private because you have some religious argument around it, and it's costing you more money than you're making in extra fees from your customers because you have better performance or something like that, and if you haven't actually measured it, if you just think this because Peter told you that back when he worked at Telia, then you need to have your head examined and somebody else needs to run your company.
I should mention that peering coordinators are opinionated too.
And if you're listening to anything that Peter said, you need to have your head examined, period.
Yes. So there are reasons. Igor listed some of the reasons. There are other reasons to use private peering. However cheap exchange ports are, they're usually not 100% free, at least not usually. So if you are peering at Equinix or Lynx or something and you have 4 10-gig ports and you find out that 11 or 8 or something gigs of that is going to one peer, it makes perfect financial sense, ignoring all the performance reasons, to pull this person off onto a private peering link. So you make those kind of calculations. On the flip side, the question about performance versus, the extra OPEX and CAPEX of having a port, a 10-gig port to push 500 megs to a peer comes into question. But these are all questions that only you can answer, because only you run your network, only you know what your customers are paying you for, only you know what equipment you're buying, only you know how much you pay your engineers. So these are all questions that you need to answer internal to your own company based on your own economics. Or at least that's the way, my opinionated self thinks. And you're welcome to tell me I'm insane that you'd rather do it and lose money.
I just want to echo what Patrick is saying. If you're doing 4 or 5 nicks to this one particular peer, but you have it up, odds are private peering will be way not cost effective.
Well, the long and short of it is the cost to peer on an exchange, the hardware to do that is not any cheaper than when you use the same hardware to do a PNI. So what you're hoping for is statistical multiplexing. You're hoping you can put multiple peers together on one port and save you money. And it very simply is a question of how much traffic am I doing to this peer in relationship to the capacity of the port. And if you're doing more than 10% of your capacity to one particular peer, or whatever the case may be, depending on your economics and the cost of the port, then it no longer makes sense. So it's a very simple math problem.
You mentioned 10%. I seem to remember Ren's here. At some point, there was a kind of a rule of thumb where some folks would say, as soon as you reach 40% of your capacity on the public peering fabric, you agree to migrate me off to a private. And the rationale was, I can't see how much overloading you're doing on your public peering fabric, so we may have some traffic going back and forth that's just fine until you oversaturate your public link. So by contractually obligating you to migrate me to privates once you reach 40%, you avoid that problem. Do I remember that correctly? It wasn't you. Okay, somebody else? Is that what you were thinking of with your 10% number?
Well, I'm not saying put that in a contract, because honestly, how are you going to enforce that? And the reality is that all of us at one point or another has had something happen where we've overrun our exchange port, and the reason that we didn't put in a second exchange port was probably price.
Oh, shoot! Sorry, I didn't see you.
So I just wanted to make a quick correction to what Patrick said. Not all of us peering coordinators are in it to make money. We do peer if we happen to be government networks, R&E networks, not-for-profit networks. That peering is for a large group of people. So if you happen to be new here and you're not in the business of making money, there's still a reason to peer. And I think Kevin had a lot of good reasons there to do it, but make or save, but then in the research community we have other reasons why we might do peering, even if it's costing us money, because maybe we have to deliver packets for a particular research thing, and that's the best way to do it. So money isn't always the issue, but it's usually a driving factor.
It's a really good point. That comes up an awful lot, especially when I do the math and sort of asking the question if peering makes sense financially with the pricing. Well, I think we are
Gear.
At Beer and Gear. So thank you guys very much, and fill out your surveys. Let us know how this worked out for you.